Hello, my name is 𝐸𝐠-𝐒𝐢𝐜𝐢𝐥𝐢𝐜, and this is part 2 of C3 Sicilian from white's perspective. So E4, C5, C3. We already covered D5 variation, which is one of the biggest chapters of theory in C3 Sicilian. We covered D6 followed by knight F6 in the part 1. So we have a couple of other continuations. The second of the most popular responses, knight F6 and also E6 variation. Okay, let's do it in random order. I want to skip G6, respond on a second move, because this is what I want to cover when I play for black. Black doesn't always get 100% equality, but they get interesting play. So you should follow me in a part 3, which is for black, when I will be covering C3 Sicilian and Smith-Morra Gambit with G6 move, which transposes and becomes the same chapter. So that's where I will be covering this G6 on the second move. So for now, we will cover only 2 moves that we have left, E6 and knight F6. Let's start with one of the main, maybe the most popular continuation for black is knight F6. E5, of course, only move that makes sense because D3, it goes beyond C3 Sicilian and it becomes more like a king's Indian attack when white goes knight F3 and bishop E2. I don't want to recommend that. So E5, knight D5, and now D4. Well, we always take the main continuation for black. C takes D, the only move that makes sense. C takes D and D6, challenging white immediately in the center. Knight F3, and now the main move, knight C6. Okay, here, white has 2 continuations. Move knight C3 that I don't recommend, because after knight C3, black can get very good position 2 different ways. And we're going to go quickly through them because right now I'm analyzing continuation that I don't recommend. Just I want to give you a little reasoning behind it. D takes E, D takes C, knight takes C3, queen D8, knight D8, BC, and bishop D7. There is not much to expect for white, and you shouldn't be playing that. And the other way, the other reason is, in this position, D takes C, and knight D to B4. That too is good for black, because if white takes and black takes, now white must go king D1, and that's not something you want to play. So now let's get to the variation that you do want to play. Bishop C4 and knight B6. You could play bishop B3, but I don't want to go through this, because if we are covering it for white, my personal preference, mine and everybody else's, is by far more popular and better move is bishop to B5. And I'm analyzing only the most popular continuations. And DE, something like E6, white castles and bishop E7, this is very passive for black. White can go queen E2. They have big space advantage and no counterplay for black. and concentration of black's pieces on the queen side, 2 knights and 2 bishops, makes their king side a little vulnerable. This is not popular variation. D takes C, knight takes C5, and bishop D7. This is one of the key variations for playing this opening. Of course, white can take bishop takes C6, but then this position is hardly any better for white. So white plays knight takes D7, queen takes D7, and knight C3. Threatening very powerful D5, natural E6, we castle. So black has to castle. They have to castle short, of course. You don't want to castle on a queen side and get mated very quickly after rook c1, and your king is going to be in dangerous position for black. So black has to castle king side, so they play bishop e7 first. Queen g4, attacking g7, castling, and here bishop takes c6. Black has 2 continuations, so take this bishop with the queen, which is the most popular, and with a pawn. Now let me tell you something about if they take with the pawn. Then white can play bishop h6, and after bishop f6, rook a to d1, knight d5, knight e4. This is uncomfortable position for black. Even if black goes king h8, we go bishop f4, and on knight d5, knight e4. c5 square is vulnerable, and this position is better for white without a doubt, even after bishop g5. You see, black has outpost after taking. Black has d5 outpost, white has c5 outpost. And it is not by much, but it's better for white. So, because white also has a play on a king side after rook d3 and possibly rook h3, knight on e4 is placed well and also may go to c5. Anyway, not too many volunteers to play this position for black. So black plays queen takes c6, and now white goes bishop h6. Bishop f6 is obvious. And now rook fd1. We're simply protecting d4 pawn. Now, what should black play here? First of all, white wants to go knight e4, and black is anxious to get out of this unpleasant pin on g file, and they will play king h8. But now knight e4, attacking bishop on f6, and black has 2 moves. Either rook g8 or bishop takes d4. After bishop takes d4, this position is highly unpleasant. Rook takes d4, gh, and knight f6. Very important move. Deprive black rook of going to g8 and doubling rooks on d file. e5, of course, is not acceptable move because after queen f5, black can resign on the spot. So this is not good continuation. So that leaves rook g8 as only move. In this position, after king h8, knight e4, rook g8 is an only move. But now it's interesting how with very limited resources, white manages to organize very powerful attack. Bishop g5. knight d5, well, you don't want to take on g5, and after knight takes g5, all of a sudden mate on f7 is threatening, and black's position highly uncomfortable. Rook d3 is threatening. And also, knight takes h7 is threatening. For example, on something like this. Knight takes h7. That may be devastating. So taking on g5 is out of question. But after knight d5, queen h5, applying more pressure on bishop on f6. And after queen h4, black is almost lost. What can happen here is if they take on g5, they get destroyed. h7 and f7 is hanging, and there is no good move here. In this position, the other option would have been bishop takes d4. Actually, this happened in a game. Rook takes d4, f5. Also, the position is very bad for black. Queen e2, fe, rook c1, and after queen e8, rook takes e4. Now, this is big advantage for white and absolutely free advantage. Free advantage means your opponent has no counterplay, has weaknesses, and has immediate problem defending their material. Position is pretty bad. But, however, maybe the best way to play. Just give a pawn and hope for a miracle. But otherwise, in bishop g5, knight d5, and queen h4, there is very difficult to find any defense for black. For example, if e5, disaster is on the way. Rook c1, attacking queen, and of queen e6, this is forced to win. And rook c5. Now, I analyzed this position and came to conclusion that black is absolutely and unconditionally busted. There is a threat of rook takes d5. Of course, black sees it, but it's very painful when you see what's coming, but there is nothing you can do about it. Bishop d8, the only temporary defense, and after d takes e, it's absolutely resignable. Very powerful conclusion from position that seems harmless. There is only one weakness on g7, well protected, natural move king h8, and almost everything is falling apart right away. Well, actually, we go knight d4 and knight d5, bishop g5. Black is already in big, big trouble. So this is one continuation that you should keep in mind. Well, when we analyze C3 Sicilian, you have to understand one thing. In order to cover every variation for white and cover all the holes and all the possible continuations, we need to make 9-hour lecture, which we could do, but I don't think any of you will be interested in watching 9-hour lecture. Doesn't matter who is lecturing. So I'm giving you some new ideas, some old ideas. I'm summarizing it, and if you want to play it on serious and very competitive basis, you have to dig yourself into the games that have been playing with it, and also dig into database and some analysis as well. I'm giving you rough ideas and rough estimate of what you're going to be going through and my personal recommendations. Now let's go back and talk a little bit about E6 variation. Okay, after E6, of course, white is going to go D4, and black has to go D5. I can't recommend for black to play CD, CD, and D5. This is not a good way to play for black because what you have a French defense. French defense in a very, very bad variety of French defense. Let me tell you what kind of French defense it is. Suppose you play French for black and you go E5, C5, C3. Now, if you took on D4 now, this is going to be, CD is very bad continuation, and this position is clearly better for white because white can develop knight on C3 in the early stage. And I don't want to go through the explanations why and what. Look at the theory of the French defense. So I want to go with the position that we may get. E4, C5, C3, E6, D4, D5. So if black plays D5 here, what I would recommend for white to do, you don't want to go E5. If you like this variation of French defense, and if you think it's okay, you feel comfortable, of course you can do it. Otherwise, I would recommend you to take on D5. Now, if queen takes on D5, you're going to get a Lapin variation C3 with the second move D5. In this position, if you play a Lapin, this position should be familiar to you, and you should know how to play it. Besides, we covered it in a part 1 of C3 Sicilian. And if black takes ED, this position is comfortable for white as well. White can play bishop E3, attacking C5 pawn. Well, on CD, bishop takes D4. White very comfortably develops knight F3, bishop E2, and castle. And C4, that's how they play in this variation. C4 always gives white a clear advantage. C takes B, A takes B. Now, if you look at this position, you will see that white is slightly ahead in development. White is a lot ahead in pawn structure positioning. They have 3 good central pawns. Pawn on D5 may be weak. White is much better. Now, let's make a few moves. Knight F6, I like to develop bishop on D3 to prevent black from playing bishop F5. On bishop E7, we may go knight F3 or knight E2, knight F3, for example. And on castling, H3. I want to go H3. Why? Of course not because I'm afraid of bishop G4 or knight G4. Now, H3 move is very good positional move. It's designed from preventing black from playing bishop G4 because bishop on C8 does not have any comfortable square after H3. It's not because we're afraid of bishop G4, it's because we want to restrict severely black's pieces. After knight C6, we castle. Black goes rook E8, for example, and we can continue on knight D2. And white has much better position. What can I say here? After bishop D6, you can go bishop G5. Otherwise, you may want to consider C4. For example, H6 is played. Now, you can go C4, and after knight B4, bishop B1, followed by knight E5 and F4 for white. White is clearly better. If you see black in this position is struggling with putting their pieces in comfortable squares. Well, if you don't want to play C4, you don't have to. This position can be played simply with knight E5, followed by F4, and never give any square. Most of the people will be a lot more comfortable with this kind of play. Either way, white has clear advantage and very easy play. And in a lot of cases in the opening, when you know exactly what you're doing and you have easy play, it's a lot more important than having some questionable advantage. And this position is good for white anytime you will play it. Again, you can go and look for the games played with it. You can find a lot of games played with it and get a lot more material from there. But roughly, we covered every continuation that may happen in the very early stage of the game after e4, c5, c3. Whatever happens, so you can, as I said, for entry level, you can learn it overnight. But if you are a competitive player, you want to get an advantage by playing c3, you can try too. And then you have to learn quite a bit, well, around something we already looked on both parts of our lecture on c3 Sicilian. So I covered c3 Sicilian vaguely, but I explained basic principles and I showed you some new good ideas. You need to do a lot more work if you want to make the c3 Sicilian main weapon for you against Sicilian. It's promising and interesting continuation. So good luck with it. Thank you very much.